Battle of Bannockburn was a decisive victory for the Scots in the First Scottish War of Independence. It had taken place between June 23rd and June 24th of the year 1314. Although it was a great victory for the Scots, it would not be the end of the war, which would continue on for 14 more years. In 1313, Bruce had called all those loyal to the previous King of Scots, King John Balliol, to lose their lands and support him as King of Scotland and to support his fight against the Kingdom of England. Along with all of these supporters, Robert the Bruce then laid siege to a Scottish royal castle by the name of Stirling Castle, which was under British occupation. In response to this Scottish show of force, King Edward II of England rallied a massive army, the largest army to ever invade Scotland, and marched against the Scots. When he arrived to break the siege, he encountered Robert the Bruce's significantly smaller army, and thus the Battle of Bannockburn began. As the opening move for the English, Edward II sent forward a cavalry detachment under the command of Earl of Gloucester and the Earl of Hereford to cross the Bannockburn across the Roman road. They encountered the main force of the Scottish army, and the whole regiment broke and fled. This was a decisive loss in the battle for Edward II, as the Earl of Hereford had been killed by Robert the Bruce himself and had severely demoralized the English army. In loss for what to do next, Edward II rallied another cavalry detachment under the command of Sir Robert Clifford to try and break through the Bannockburn on the northern flank of the Scots. Clifford's charge across the northern Bannockburn took him right into the hands of the Scottish Earl of Moray. In the heated battle that followed, Clifford's regiments broke up and fled. The fighting next day would take place on a much smaller stretch of the battlefield between the Bannockburn River and Roman Road. Before the battle, during the night, a defector from the English army, a Scottish noble by the name of Sir Alexander Seyton, brought news to Robert the Bruce about the English army's morale and their position of the camp. The English morale had been severely damaged and in some cases broken due to their losses the day before, and now Alexander Seyton was convincing Robert the Bruce to launch a full-on attack to finally break and destroy the English morale and the English army as a result. During the night, Edward took the initiative and moved the remainder of his forces across the Bannockburn and positioned them between Roman Road and the river. Robert reorganized his army under the commands of himself, his brother Edward Bruce, Sir James Douglas, and of course the Earl of Moray. A cavalry detachment under the command of Sir Robert Keith was to hold the Scottish vanguard and cover any surprise attacks by the English. Robert then did something unprecedented in the history of Scottish combat. He used his schiltrons, which were usually cubes of men carrying spears and acting very similar to a phalanx formation, which are usually used for defense, in an offensive fashion, a tactic that his predecessor William Wallace had never thought to use. Using this tactic, Robert the Bruce charged directly at the English, which were pinned between his forces and the Bannockburn. In a stroke of desperation, Edward II pulled back his longbowmen, which was doing severe damage to the battalions of Moray and Douglas, in an attempt to hit them from their northern flank, and as such Edward pulled them back and moved them further north. Seeing this hole in their defences, Sir Robert Keith used his cavalry detachment and charged directly at the longbowmen and shattered the whole battalion, destroying the English's most potent weapon. The English army was now in strokes of death. Edward, realizing that the battle was not going to be won by the English, took his King's Guard and fled from the battlefield. James Douglas, having punched a hole in the English defences, then charged after Edward, chasing him across countryside. With the English army now shattered and seeing their ruler desert them, they started wavering. The remaining English forces tried to fight as much as they could, but eventually they started to waver and eventually shattered under the ferocity of the Scottish attack. The battle was won for the Scots. Now for some end-of-battle statistics. The battle had taken place between the Kingdom of Scotland and the Kingdom of England. The leader of the Scots was Robert the Bruce, and the leader of the English was of course Edward II. Some of the Scottish commanders included Edward Bruce, Sir Robert Keith, James Douglas and Thomas Randolph, while some of the English commanders included Humphrey de Bohun, Aymer de Valence, Gilbert de Clare and Robert de Clifford. The Scots had a relatively small army of 5,000 to 10,000 men, while the English had a much larger army of 13,700 to 25,000 men. The Scots took modest casualties ranging between 400 to 4,000 men, while the Kingdom of England took massive casualties of 700 cavalry and 4,000 to 11,000 infantry having been lost. The overall result was a decisive victory for Robert the Bruce in Scotland and a shattering defeat for the Kingdom of England.